Yeah, so as Alan suggested, I'm going to talk a little bit about WordPress here. And so I think Michael mentioned it earlier that quite a few people actually do host their blog or their website on WordPress. So I guess one of the questions that comes up is, WordPress really is the platform that people are hosting their stuff on? And the answer is definitely yes. About 59%, not of all websites, that's definitely not what we're talking about here. We're talking about 59% of people that use a CMS to build their website are actually using WordPress. So that's a ridiculous number of people that use WordPress. And the nearest competitors in terms of people that are other CMSs is going to be things you've probably heard of like Drupal or Joomla. But I mean, they're not even a tenth of the size. And in terms of the growth, WordPress is actually gaining market share still. So in terms of if you're building a website with a content management platform, the developers, the support, everything you're going to find is actually going to be for WordPress. And so it's a pretty interesting platform. And if you guys, how many of you guys use Stack Overflow here? I mean, interestingly enough, if you look at the survey for 2016 for Stack Overflow, this is actually one of the full platform developer trades. It's actually, I think, number 10. And so that means that they're competing with like .NET in terms of the number of developers that focus just on WordPress. And so there's a ridiculous number of people that actually know how to develop for this and a lot of people that are actually using it. And in terms of like, can you make professional websites with WordPress? The answer is definitely yes. People like TechCrunch, Mashable, and the New York Times, their main pages are all driven off of WordPress. So it's actually a pretty interesting thing in that there's a lot of stuff happening here, and there's a lot of small businesses out there that are saying, you know what, I really would like a WordPress site. I'd like to be able to do this. But then the question is, how do I do it? Sometimes it feels like, maybe as Michael mentioned, there's not as many options when you purchase these things from a vendor. Or, I mean, how do I host this myself? Might be a question some people ask. And so for this talk, I wanted to get into some of the technical details of like how WordPress works and some of the stuff in terms of Vendasta's working on developing a WordPress platform that we can offer to our small businesses. And when I say at scale, it's because we've got 100,000 small businesses, I guess a little more, that use our platform. And so it's a big difference in terms of I want to host a WordPress site for my business, and the question of, okay, I want to actually talk about how I would host 100,000 plus WordPress sites for small business. And so I thought it might be an interesting talk to discuss, like how you do it for yourself, but also then why it's different when you want to host it at scale. So if we're talking about you wanting to host a single WordPress site, it's actually not too bad. You've got an Apache server, some sort of web server. This is pretty standard stuff. In terms of, it's a basic web application, and it's actually written in PHP. And for the developers out there that are kind of cringing at that point, I mean, Facebook's written in PHP. So there's actually a lot of big applications that run on PHP, and it's possible to do these things in a performant way. And so if you were going to run a simple WordPress site, you can do a one-click deployment on something like Google Compute, or you could use GoDaddy or something. But if you wanted a piece, like a virtual machine to run this guy, cost of one of these guys would be about, the costing on Google's compute would be about $4 a month for you to host something like this. And that would be using an open source stack, and that doesn't include obviously any of the creative talent for building your website. That's just hosting the software. That doesn't include a domain, that doesn't include like SSL certificates and stuff, but it's a basic idea. So this is something that at a cost of $4 a month that, a lot of people for a website, they're looking for something to cost quite a bit less than that, especially if you're looking at, competing with people like GoDaddy or other things like that. They're offering sites that, they're costing on the order of $1 or $2 a month. And so if your cost is $4, I mean, what are we talking about? But this is basically the infrastructure that happens here for a single web server. Now, one of the things that I think is really important to talk about at this point is the security around WordPress. It is a PHP program, it is open source, and it has a ton of security vulnerabilities. How many people heard about the Panama paper exploits that happened about a month or so ago? That was actually a WordPress vulnerability that caused that. And so what happened was these people here on this file system that's shown in yellow, that's actually where they kept all their confidential account information. And so someone actually hacked their WordPress site, and then actually once they had access to the site hosting WordPress, they managed to access all of their confidential financial information. I mean, it works out that they weren't good people, and so it wasn't maybe all bad, but in terms of for you, I'm going to assume that you're not a bad person, and you probably don't want to necessarily put let's say, your accounting system on the same machine that you put your WordPress on. So there's a couple options for how to deal with security, but let's say in this case you just have a single machine that hosts your WordPress. There's nothing else on it, so if someone steals your WordPress login due to a vulnerability, it's really your WordPress site is all you're worried about, right? So that's one thing to consider in this case. So then if you're talking about someone like a GoDaddy or someone else like this, or even let's say a small agency in Saskatoon and you wanted to host a lot of WordPress sites, you're probably not going to put a single virtual machine for every one of these sites. It's a little bit hard to manage, and then you have to buy IP addresses and all sorts of other things. So what you often will do actually is you'll run something which, it's called virtual hosting. And so this is probably something everybody's heard of. You get a virtual server or something, you got Apache here. It's running multiple copies of PHP. It's got individual users for each one of those pools. And then what happens is you've got file systems to protect so that each WordPress instance is restricted to just its files. And so we're using the fact that the PHP interpreter is running as a specific user, and so they only have access to the files for that one WordPress site. So generally, if you're doing it this way and you're not running your PHP processes all as the same user, you run into this is actually a decent way to run this stuff. And this is how a lot of people are going to run. And then again, you need a database here. So you're going to actually probably have one database server here that's actually running multiple databases inside. So one instance, multiple databases. And if you're doing something like this actually changes your cost model quite a bit, because we're running 100 WordPress sites now, and we're running it on a bigger machine. So instead of costing $4, it costs about $30. But in terms of this, I mean, it gets our cost for a WordPress site down to about 30 cents. And so this is something you're going to see for GoDaddy or someone else like that this is possibly how they're managing to serve this stuff. But, there's a limit, and then we're going to call this vertical scale. And so in terms of computers, there's kind of two ways to scale an application. One's a vertical and one's a horizontal. It's an easy way to think about it is vertical means make a bigger machine. Horizontal means make more machines. And so as an example here, we've just put up a bigger machine, we've put more stuff onto it, and we're going to make the assumption that the 100 WordPress sites we put on here, they're probably not all extremely popular, and so there's probably some ability to say that some use a little more, some use a little less, that's okay. And so, this gets our cost into a place, and then we still keep some of the security benefits we're talking about. But then the question is, okay, let's say you want to deploy like 1,000 WordPress sites. You're probably going to run into a point where you really can't serve 1,000 sites from one machine, because having 1,000 PHP pools and 1,000 databases and stuff is probably not going to scale. And so you're going to be forced into this, okay, I want to horizontally scale out. And so now I've got 10 copies of essentially what I had before. And so again, my cost stays the same, and my security model stays the same, but now you got to manage like 10 different machines with 10 different patches. And I wore this shirt for a reason. Is like one of the things you're going to find is that this came from the Google Next conference, and one of the things they say is that when you're dealing with this world, it's actually you that has to update the virtual machines here. So like when the Linux kernel needs a new patch and there's a vulnerability on your WordPress site, you have to go out and patch that. And in this case, now you got 10 machines you have to go patch. And now you have to patch not only 10 versions of your OS or 10 versions of Apache, you've now got 1,000 versions of WordPress you got to patch, right? So there's quite a bit of work in terms of maintaining this sort of solution. And so when we started looking at some of these things in terms of how people do this, it kind of becomes like, this is probably not the way we want to scale it when we're going to do 100,000 sites. So it's one of the things that we started to look at. Well, how could we, like, what kind of assumptions could we look at, and how could we make this scale a little better? And so one of the things we can look at in terms of small businesses is you're going to find that there's how many people have heard of something called a long tail? And so what the long tail is going to talk about here, in our particular, this describes a whole bunch of things. It's like the normal distribution, and there's a lot of natural things that fit this. And what you're going to find is that if you have 100,000 small businesses, you're going to find there's a few businesses that have absolutely huge traffic websites. They do a ton of traffic. And then you're going to find that most small businesses have 2 visitors. They want to build a WordPress site. They definitely want one, but you can imagine that their traffic is not thousands of users or visits per month. They're talking about tens. Now, that's obviously for some of these guys, that's they're just starting, and maybe they want to become one of those guys that's the head as opposed to the tail here. But the truth becomes in a lot of these places that most of the users in our system actually aren't doing much. Most of the time their WordPress instance is actually serving no traffic. And so if you look at this particular case we had here, each one of these sites is tied to one of these nodes, and so capacity for every one of those sites is pre-allocated. And so what we look at also is, since each one of those sites is on one of those computers, if you start managing thousands of computers, failure is actually real. It happens. It's not like if it happens, it's when it happens. And so, in the other case, we have zero tolerance for failure, because each one of those servers, each one of those websites is only on one of those servers. And so then we also get into, I've got, in this case of 1,000 sites, I've got 10 different servers I got to manage config for. So, in the end, we decided this wasn't really a way to do it. And so what we look to is the rest of our applications here we do with Google App Engine. And so this is a picture of how Google App Engine does its serving. And so one of the things that's really key to this infrastructure is a thing called a load balancer. And so this is what sits in front of Google App Engine. And so that actually means there's one website, and what happens is it has a whole pool of front-end instances. And so in this case, I've drawn 3 because the slide is limited to how many of those boxes I can draw. But one of our applications, as an example, has 4,000 of those. And so what that means is that there's 4,000 machines that are ready to serve a request when it comes in, and it doesn't matter which, basically each of those machines is equivalent. So any one of those machines is equally capable of serving a request, and the load balancer can be smarter, it can do round robin and pick one. But the answer now is that my application can serve from any one of those. And so if one of them dies, who cares? It's not a big deal. I forget, it's cattle versus, what is it? Anyways, the point is the idea to think of these machines as like, these machines are disposable. These machines die, and that's okay, because we got a whole pool of them, and any one of them is equally capable of serving the content. But then what it requires is some sort of distribution of your data store. And so the data that we're going to store for, and in this case, an application, is stored in some sort of distributed storage so that each one of those front ends can all access it. And so the nice part about this is it gives us, the first piece that this gives us is that these front ends, we have the failure tolerance, but the more important part is because any one of these front ends is equally capable of serving, there's no pre-allocation. And so thinking about this from our WordPress picture, it's a little bit more complicated, but what we end up having is we have this service. It's not called a load balancer, but a service is an abstraction on it. And then we have these WordPress pods, they're called. And so what happens is each one of these pods is capable of serving any one of the sites that we're hosting. And so in case of 100,000 sites, that means if a request comes into our service, it can go ahead and distribute that to any one of these, and any one of those pods is capable of serving any one of our sites. And so what that actually means is that we don't have a pre-allocation. We don't say that this node is specifically designed to host this site. Any one of those nodes is capable of hosting any one of the sites. And so that gives us 2 pieces. First of all, on the long tail, that allows us to deal with the tail, which is we got a bunch of sites that nobody ever uses. And since we're not pre-allocating nodes to say this node hosts this site, that means those sites don't actually waste any of our machines. But then for the head, which if you look at this, these are the sites, if I come back, these are the sites on the left part. These are really poor colors. Unfortunately, I just grabbed this GIF because I'm not going to draw this graph. There's a little line here. This is the green, this is the head. But what happens is for those sites that have a lot of traffic, you can actually use multiple nodes to serve for that single site. So if a site has a ton of traffic, it could actually be using 10 or 20 or 30 nodes to serve that traffic. And so as our system scales, we actually get the capability to handle more traffic for those head sites and our ability to not pre-allocate for those smaller sites. And so in this particular case, in order to service that, we have to have a filer service in the back end, which is this, if you talk about this bottom part, this is Gluster. This is essentially allowing us to have a shared file system between all those machines. So the WordPress is actually accessible from any one of those machines. Now, the first question that everybody should ask at this point is, that sounds really scary, because I got 100,000 WordPress sites, and if you hack one of them, you're going to have access to all 100,000 of those sites. That could be bad, because potentially we have financial services information on one of them. Hopefully not, they're small business. But anyways, it's still something important to consider. And the other thing that I think is important on this is that because we also can be dynamic about our config, we could even migrate databases. And so if we're looking at that individual piece, this is one of those green boxes from this picture. This is actually what's inside of here. And again, when we were talking about this, this is essentially the WordPress instance that we were talking about before. And instead of Apache, we use a little bit of different software. And specifically what we do here is we use a distributed config so that we can actually dynamically connect to different databases and allow migrations. And so what happens here is the little piece of magic that we put together here, you can call it a FCGI to CGI Bridge. This is where what we actually do is, rather than having fixed allocation before we serve these processes, what happens is Nginx does a fast CGI process to one of our applications, and I drew it in green here because that's code that we wrote. And so what ends up happening is at the start of a request, Nginx is going to be like your Apache in the previous one. We know what site we're trying to serve once the request comes in. And then based on that site, what happens is our project actually selects a user, sets that user ID on our process before executing any WordPress code. So what that actually means is that in terms of WordPress, WordPress is locked down to a single user, But because we have another process that's spawning our WordPress, what happens is we're actually able to go ahead and lock that security down. And so we get the similar security protection that we had before, but now we have this ability to scale this out. And so the abilities to scale this thing, and I promise I'm just about done here, is that what we're able to do is, let's say there's too much CPU or too much network serving load, we're able to add one of those front-end instances, and we can add 1 or 2 or 3, and it doesn't mean that we have to scale that out in the previous example of like 100 sites at a time, or maybe 10 sites at a time, or however many fit on a node. We can just add a node to the pool and see if that changes the serving characteristics. And again, that can be like, as we grow, it becomes finer and finer grained the amount of capacity we can add. And then also, let's say we're running out of file system space. We didn't pre-allocate how much space each of these guys had. We have a separate replication controller for Gluster. And so what we can actually do is we can scale our size based on what's actually used as opposed to fixed size per site. And then the last part is the databases are separate, and we can actually, because of our distributed config, we can migrate databases at runtime as well. And so what it means is that depending on how the scalability runs out, we can actually independently scale all 3 of these things to minimize our costs while keeping better performance. Is kind of the goal of what this whole thing is. And so in terms of just to summarize here, quite a few of these things allow us to address specifically the assumption is this long tail. And so because of this long tail serving, this is why we do some of these things, and it allows us to get a cost that's in line with the previous ones with a much more manageable config. So that's what I wanted to talk about today.